Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session, second week of our classes. We are going to talk about the nature and sources of conflict today. I hope you had the chance to do the readings for this week, but if you didn't, please do so and prepare for the discussion session. So, what does this image represent? This is the famous conflict curve, which shows the stage that conflict is going through from peace to reconciliation. As you can see, there are different stages of intervention from peacetime diplomacy to post conflict peace building. And inside the curve, you have these interventions that are corresponding to each stage of the conflict. During the periods of stable peace, we usually have peacetime diplomacy as an intervention. When peace becomes unstable, we have preventive diplomacy and conflict prevention. And when we start to have outbreaks of violence, the usual intervention is crisis or conflict management. After the violence escalates into full-blown conflict, we need to employ conflict management and peacemaking strategies such as mediation, negotiation, arbitration. And after the peace agreement has been reached, we have peace enforcement and conflict mitigation. After that comes peacekeeping, and the final stage is post-conflict peace building and conflict resolution stage that should result in reconciliation of the parties after conflict. So the peak of the curve is called mutually hurting stalemate, which happens when both parties are hurting in conflict and then they are ready to talk about a peaceful resolution. This is when conflict becomes ripe for resolution. So mutually hurting stalemate is a concept developed by William Zartman. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about a life cycle of conflict. A conflict has its own life cycle. It appears and eventually reaches an emotional and even violent climax. It then tapers off, disappears, and often reappears. So the curve is a basic model that represents stages of conflict, but in real life, conflicts have many curves. They can reemerge intermittently and even become protracted or intractable. That means difficult to resolve. Now, this image, if you can see it, this image represents Galtung's triangle, which is an important tool for understanding and analyzing conflict occurrence. So, goals and interests and aspirations of parties may be incompatible. Therefore, a contradiction or conflict is born. Any actor or party with unrealized goals gets frustrated. So, this frustration may lead to aggression or to violence, turning inward as attitude of hatred or outward as behavior of verbal or physical violence. Hatred and violence may be directed toward the holders of the goal standing in the way, but it's not always that rational. Violence is intended to harm and hurt, including oneself, and may generate a spiral of counter-violence as a defense or revenge. This spiral of hatred and violence becomes a meta-conflict over the goals of preserving or destroying. Keep in mind that the life cycle can start and end and then start again. So the life cycle of conflict can start and then end and then restart. Imagine conflict more as a spiral or a cycle because it's usually not linear. So there are these intermittent cycles of conflict and violence. Okay, so one of the most common definitions of conflict is that conflict is a perceived or actual divergence of interests. So party A has certain interest that is incompatible to the interests of party B. Conflict size depends on how divergent interests are and how rigid the parties' aspirations are. So the rigidness of a conflict depends on imported interests, strongly felt principles, no alternatives, and also legitimate and just claims. So when we look at the conflict, it's also important to understand the feature of the parties. Who are the parties? Keep in mind that parties can be persons, groups, nations, and even non-persons, such as, say, organization or a business. Conflicts emerge as a consequence of zero-sum thinking. What is this zero-sum thinking? Well, it's a thinking when one party thinks if I get something, then the other party cannot get anything. Now, a little bit about conflict sources. What are conflict sources? What do they include? Sources, like roots of conflict, where are they coming from? Well, they can come from scarcity or lack of resources, which leads to unfulfilled basic human needs. So conflict, for example, may lead to destruction of infrastructure or livelihoods, so people cannot, fulfill their need for food or shelter, which are some basic human needs, and this can lead to conflict and prolonging of conflict. Rapid progress and change can also bring about conflict. Examples, let's say, civil rights movements in 1960s, women's movement, dissolution of Yugoslavia in 1990s. All of that was caused by this rapid change, fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War made big impact on Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. Conflicts do not always include physical, direct violence. Conflicts can also be structural. So, some kind of injustice, oppression is embedded in the structure or institution of a society. And these kind of structural problems can be characterized by racism, nationalism, salary inequity. Conflicts can also be cultural and embedded in the culture of a society. That means that they can become a part of a value system, metaphors, discourses, and symbols used in public and private spheres. Class structures, castes, and similar can also be the source of conflict. Okay, so these are two important concepts to remember. There are two types of deprivation which also lead to conflict. One is absolute deprivation and the other is relative deprivation. Absolute deprivation is when person or society does not even have the most basic human needs taken care of. For example, a person doesn't have food or access to health services. Relative deprivation is relative in nature and compared to others who and it requires this comparison of one person to the others who may have more than this person has. Some groups or individuals in the same society have more privileges and benefits than the other. So the comparison and relationship with the other who are better off causes frustration and eventually conflict. Relative deprivation is perceived as lack of something compared to others. It can be real or actual, or it can be just a matter of perception. Relative deprivation is caused by unfavorable social position of a certain group or individual when compared to the others. Better off members of a specific group. So, Let's mention this from your book, from Woodhouse book. The theories that help us analyze and understand conflict that we should pay attention to are socio-psychological theories. So socio-psychological, and on other side you have socio-political and economic theories. So these are like two big blocks of theories. These socio-psychological theories attempt to explain conflicts in terms of what goes in the minds of men, of people, and the social, political, economic theories seek an explanation in terms of social, economic, and political factors, such as levels of armament, divergence of economic and political interests. An important scholar of conflict resolution is Azar, Edward Azar, and now we are going to look at his theory of protracted social conflict in more depth. So Azar connected psychological and structural economic theories. He connected micro and macro theories, and also he observes conflict as an integral part of social interactions. So he basically says that mutually incompatible goals among parties, amidst the lack of coordinating or mediating mechanisms, can give birth to conflict. Conflicts can be accounted for by looking into the pattern and structure of intrusion by international political, economic, and military systems into domestic realm. So he is the one also looking at the outside foreign interference into the local conflicts, which is important. And protracted social conflict denotes hostile interactions between communities, between some communal groups that are based on some identity, deep-seated racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural identities. And this persists over a long period of time with sporadic outbreaks of violence. So the groups that are in conflict in a certain society have a history of conflict and intermittent outbreaks of violence. So basically, when one group's identity is threatened or frustrated, then intractable conflict is almost inevitable. So this is very important. In Azar's theory, there are 4 preconditions of protracted social conflict. These are communal content, basic human needs, and governance and state role, and international linkages. These are the 4 preconditions. Communal content. So if a society characterized by multi-communal composition, if it is characterized as multi-communal, then protracted conflicts are most likely to arise. Moreover, colonial legacy and history of rivalry and some kind of a contest among communal actors are 2 factors which are responsible for the rise of politically active multi-communal societies. Second condition is human needs. Individual or communal survival is contingent upon the satisfaction of material needs, some basic needs. When there is physical scarcity, these basic needs are seldom evenly or justly met. So there usually is a grievance resulting from deprivation, and failure to redress these grievances by the authority, by the government, cultivates a niche for a protracted social conflict. Now we go to the 3rd condition. This is governance and the state role. Deprivation or satisfaction of human needs for physical security, access to political and social institutions, and acceptance of communal identity is largely a result of social, political, and economic interactions. The state is endowed with authority to govern and to use force when necessary to regulate society, protect citizens, and protect property. Therefore, the level of satisfaction or deprivation of basic human needs is generally influenced by the intervening or mediating role of the state. So the structure, the characteristics of the state, of the government, is really important. Most states which experience protracted social conflict tend to be characterized by incompetent, parochial, fragile, and authoritarian governments that fail to satisfy basic human needs of their people. And the fourth precondition of protracted social conflict are international linkages. Formation of domestic social and political institutions and their impact on the role of the state are greatly influenced by the patterns of the international system. So there are two models of international linkages. Dependency, so there is a dependent relationship, not only not only limits the autonomy of particular states, but it also distorts the pattern of economic development, impeding the satisfaction of security needs. There is a political and military client relationship with strong states. In a client relationship, the patron, the powerful state provides protection for the client state in return for that state's loyalty. So client loyalty and obedience involve some sacrifice of autonomy or independence, which induces the client state to pursue both domestic and foreign policies disjoint from the needs of its own public. Okay, so it becomes kind of a puppet of the powerful state. How to help resolve protracted social conflict? Reducing overall overt conflict requires reduction in underdevelopment, levels of underdevelopment. So groups that seek to satisfy their identity and security needs through conflict are in effect seeking change in the structure of their society. So to address conflict in that society, we need to really address the development and underdevelopment of the state and the structure of government. CR approaches that focus on resources or the interests of parties may be appropriate means of transforming conflicts where the only issues are those of resource and interests. However, in protracted conflicts, the main issues are identity-based. Therefore, to be effective, a conflict resolution framework must specifically emphasize the needs and identities of the conflicting parties. And to address those can be quite complex and quite difficult. Communal action and strategies that can be done by the communities themselves to address the protracted social conflict are voicing collective and individual grievances and collective nonviolent protests. Some state actions and strategies may include that the state accommodates communal grievances and improves the satisfaction of communal needs in the initial stage, and any authentic accommodation or concession may be perceived, however, as a sign of defeat. Therefore, the state sometimes avoids such strategy and employs coercive repression or instrumental co-option of people or the leaders, let's say, of the protest movements. Uh, how else can we address PSCs? Well, conflicts associated with communal identity and fear of marginalization or loss of communal integrity tend to involve an enduring and antagonistic set of perceptions and interactions among communal groups and the state. So it is important to analyze the perceptions and cognitive processes generated through experience of these conflictual interactions. Outcome analysis is also very important. So protracted conflicts, unlike the other conflicts, other types of conflicts, do not have clear termination points. Outcomes, insofar as they do not satisfy basic needs, contain latent conflicts which goes further, cycles of manifest conflict, often involving a shift or spillover in issues and actors. Well, they can become, they can spill over to other regions and countries, and they can become regional conflicts. Okay, so there was a lot of thoughts on the theories, important theories on conflict, as ending with Azar's complex theory. So I hope you enjoy this presentation, and thanks for listening. I will see you next time.